So I think most of you have been here before, so welcome back. And to those of you, especially maybe some freshmen from Thomas More, welcome. This is Mercy Hall, and this is our Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture. It's the public outreach of the college. We host a number of events throughout the semester, and this is our first event of the semester. And we're very delighted to be welcoming Dr. Jennifer Bryson to the center and to New Hampshire and to Thomas More College. I'm Amy Fahey. I organize the talks, and just a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you haven't been here before, there is a restroom. It is behind Dr. Fahey. He will wave and, and beckon you. And there will be some time after Dr. Bryson's remarks for question and answer, and then some time for refreshment and fellowship. And so I just also wanted to mention some other events that we have coming up, especially our next event. If you haven't signed up for the center mailing list, you should. And if you sign up for the college mailing list, you will get notifications about all of the center events. But our next event coming up is on the Feast of St. Michael. It's on September 29th. And we have Sam Goodwin coming. Sam is coming to speak about his captivity in Syria and his imprisonment. He has recently written a memoir called Saving Sam. And that is sure to be a very powerful talk, so I encourage you all to come for that. There are a number of other lectures throughout the semester. We have Jacob Imam coming from New Polity, and we have Andrew Abella coming to speak to us on the virtues as super habits, which is the title of his recent book with CUA Press. And those are all, with the exception of this lecture, they're usually on Mondays. So please visit the center website at www.restorationofchristianculture.org, and it will have all of the registration information about the future events. So Dr. Bryson graciously agreed to come on rather short notice, and I wanted to say a few words about how I first learned of Dr. Bryson and her work, and it's to me a very sort of providential story. I was sent by Bishop Erik Varden, who's the Bishop of Trondheim in Norway, because I do some work on Sigurd Undset. He sent me an article about her novel, The Wild Orchid, that was by Ida Friederike Görres, whom I had never heard of, and it was translated by Jennifer Bryson. And so it was an excellent article, and I thought, who is Jennifer Bryson? So I did my internet sleuthing, which my husband knows I'm famous for, so I will find out anything about you that's ever been put on the internet, so be careful what's out there. And I was just fascinated when I started to learn about Dr. Bryson and what she's done. And as I learned more about her, I started to think, oh, this is like Carolyn Keene or Franklin W. Dixon, if any of those names ring bells with you. Of course. the supposed author of the Nancy Drew series or the Hardy Boys. Like, there is no Jennifer Bryson. There's a team of Jennifer Brysons somewhere, because one human being could not have possibly done all of these things. So I found out that she worked for the U.S. Intelligence Agency, that she served for a couple of years as an interrogator at Guantanamo. I found out that she was fluent in many languages, and not only in Arabic, but in German, and that she had worked for a number of foundations, and that she had taught at a number of institutions. And then, most curious, I found out that she did puppet theater. And that not only one puppet theater, but multiple puppet theaters. That she was a master gardener, that she had started something called Flying Fox Puppet Theater that teaches about soil conservation and pollination. And I almost brought puppets to introduce her tonight. And then she confessed to me that she almost said she was going to come up and begin her talk with a puppet. So we were kind of thinking along the same lines, which is a little strange. But, and she has another puppet project, which is the Creation Theology Fellowship. Am I getting that right? Which teaches the biblical story. It's the biblical narrative of creation. And so at the time, I was working on puppet theater too. So, as one does. So I was about to give a talk to the Chesterton Society in New Orleans on Sigurd Undset and Chesterton's toy theaters. And so I called her up. Well, first I went on her website and I did one of these things because, you know, her email address isn't on there. So I sent a message into the ether saying, I'm Amy Fahey at Thomas More College, and I've read your work on Sigurd Undset, and I'm also interested in puppets. So I waited and kept checking my inbox, frantically hoping for a response. And then I get this response that is titled something like, Sigurd Undset and yes, puppets. And she confessed that I was the first person, not only the first person who asked her about her work with puppets, but also the first person to unite that with Sigurd Undset. So I thought we're off to a good start. But when I learned of, obviously looking at her bio, and it's just incredible what she's done. And she's written quite extensively on Ida Friederike Görres, and her translation work is just a great service to the Church and to American Catholics, because this is a woman, as you will hear, who deserves to be better known. And she is the perfect person to be undertaking this labor of love, of translation. It's clear she has such a deep affection and affinity for Görres as a writer, as a person, and yes, there are books available. So the translation, so two of the translations are available. The biography of John Henry Newman, A Life Sacrifice, published by Ignatius, is available for purchase and signing, right? Afterwards, maybe. And The Church in the Flesh, published by Cluny Press, and we're very grateful to have John Clark, publisher of Cluny, here this evening. Cluny's doing amazing work, publishing work, so we're very grateful for their efforts as well. And then a forthcoming work that I think we'll hear a little bit about this evening on Ida Görres and marriage. So I don't want to delay any further, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Bryson.
I'd like to talk to you tonight about how this author you've never heard of, whose name you might be uncomfortable trying to pronounce, Ida Friederike Görres, can be an important guide for us as Catholics, for others too today, on how to navigate sanctity, marriage, and, to quote her, demolition crews in the Church. She was born in 1901 in Bohemia, in a little village on a family estate to a noble family. Her father had been a diplomat in the Habsburg Empire, and while he was stationed in Tokyo, Japan, he met the woman who'd become her mother. So she's half Japanese, half Austrian. Her mother had come to the Habsburg Empire in the late 1800s and is actually somewhat famous as one of the first Japanese in Europe. So she has this very unusual background, and she then, her father dies when she's young. She has a very difficult situation at home with her mother. Her mother sort of adored the older brothers and rejected the daughters. She even said to the daughters she thought they were ugly because they were half Asian, half European. So she comes from this difficult home situation, and then, as is common for the upper class families, she's sent to boarding school. She gets kicked out of the first one, and it's actually kind of a funny story. I hope to write about it someday. She's very strong-willed young woman, and I think a little too outspoken. And I found out later she hated the school. So she's sent to another one in St. Pölten that's run by what are known as the Mary Ward sisters. And it's there that she encounters love for the first time in her life. She is cared for by the sisters, she experiences community, and there as a young teenager, she also, though she's baptized 2 days after she was born and raised Catholic, it had been, sort of a cultural habit. It's just what the family does. She knew her older brothers mocked religion and church and faith. But here it was something real. And so she has a spiritual encounter, experience, conversion of some sort as a teenager. And from then on, the whole trajectory of her life changes, and the rest of her life is dedicated to the church. In her own writings, she even comments, quote, "The church has been a father and a mother to me," end quote. It was for her what home wasn't, and she then spent 2 years after high school in the novitiate for the Mary Ward sisters, but discerned that she was called to be a Catholic in the world. And she was already also by this point, before she had entered, when she was 19 years old, she published her first book, which is a play about the Song of Songs. She's already a gifted writer, and she spends the rest of her life as a writer, and all of her writing is about the church. And also what's at the heart of her writing and her passion is she writes for a lay audience. She's very educated, but not an academic. And she wants to reach the lay person, probably the educated lay person, in the pew who's kind of on autopilot, and move that person to faith on fire. So this common thread throughout her works, but 3 central themes that we find in her works are sanctity, marriage, which I'm going to explain. We're going to understand marriage and many other things related to it, which she thinks can't be separated. And then the church itself, what it is, what it means to be in the church, and how to go through difficult times. I'd like to start with sanctity because she's perhaps most famous as a hagiographer for her, it's considered renewal of hagiography in the 20th century, and also just for her absolute love of the saints at a time when Enlightenment rationalism is saying, oh, we don't pay attention to those silly old stories anymore. And she's saying, oh, yes, we do, and here's why. She wrote on many saints. I started compiling a bibliography of her works on the saints and realized I'm going to have to postpone publishing it for a year or two because I keep finding more. Almost nobody has paid attention to her. There isn't even a complete bibliography of her works. Her papers are neglected, sitting in a room in Germany, with a kind of desperate situation coming up where they need to be moved soon, and the family that has had them sitting in this room for years can't keep them anymore, and nobody's interested. So a lot of this work of things like trying to come up with a list of which saints she wrote on, there's just a lot of basic work to be done. But a few I can mention are, for example, St. Elizabeth of Hungary. One of her first books was on the nature of sanctity. And while it's addressing the bigger question of what is sanctity, she frames it as a dialogue between two people about St. Elizabeth of Hungary. And the same year this came out in German, Christopher Dawson and T.F. Burns knew about it and chose it to be translated into English, published by Sheet and Ward, and they included it in their series Religion and Culture, which is available through Cluny Media. She wrote about Joan of Arc. She has a wonderful set of letters to young women on questions of vocation, to a young woman who has a vocation to become a nun, to a woman who thinks she does, but it turns out she doesn't, another young woman who's probably in the world and might marry, and attached to that is this great essay she has about Saint Joan of Arc. And that is available. I'm not paid by Cluny Media to say this, but that's available thanks to Cluny Media, because Frank Sheed brought it out in 1949 in a collection called Saints Are Not Sad. So that essay is in there. The book Ida Görres wrote in the 30s for young women of vocation was translated into English. At first, almost all her works were translated right away into English in the 30s, but it's out of print. She wrote on Henry Suso, Hedwig of Silesia, Francis, John Henry Newman, who was really a great favorite of hers, and St. Stephen, and then her masterpiece is considered her book on St. Therese of Lisieux, called The Hidden Face. Now, she's also very keen to try to explain what sanctity is, especially, as I said, to a culture that's starting to say, well, saints were just silly old stories and we don't talk about them anymore, and it would be embarrassing to celebrate a saint's feast day because we're modern people. So in her book, The Church in the Flesh, written in 1950, this is a very common genre for her, because, as I said, she's always trying to connect with the reader and move that reader's heart. So a number of her works are letters, and they're not letters in the sense of a copy of something she had sent by post in actual correspondence. They're letters I think some of them are composites of real letters, but they're letters, as we might say, epistolary essays. And so in the 6th chapter, and the entire book crescendos, there's 6 chapters total, so the 6th is the crown of the whole book. And what topic does she save that for? The saints. And this book is addressed to mostly young people and some others, these 6 letters who really have the zeitgeist of the era on an IV drip. They want to be modern and cool and hip and get rid of all this old fuddy-duddy stuff. There's a very clear sense from some of her interlocutors of, can't we just be spiritual but not religious? And she wrote this in 1950, mind you, but she's got her finger on the pulse, and one of them is actually based on her niece, who's from one of these very secular older brothers she has. And the 6th one, it starts out with this interlocutor, has been writing to her saying, why do you spend, because by this point Ida Görres is known for her hagiography, why do you spend so much time on the saints? Do you still do that? I don't see what the point is. And here's what her response is, quote, "For me, the saint is the most important person, not only in the church. The saint is the most important person in the world because the saint is the decisive answer to the big riddle. What is a human being? The saint is the terrifying statement, humans are sanctificabilis, quote, holyable. This word does not exist in our language. Why not, actually? But such a thing does exist. Humans are beings who can already partake of God's holiness in this mammalian body. The human is created and called to be perfected in such holiness and to exist in it for eternity. Is there a greater, more exciting claim about us? A claim, if it is true, that concerns us in a more burning manner? And is not the fact itself enormous that the church never runs out of courage and breath to shout this most unlikely of all assertions out loud into the world from century to century, unconcerned about how it sounds?" End quote. If you're interested in Görres and her writing on sanctity, I can't encourage you enough to pick one of her works on the saints. There are a lot that haven't been translated, but some might be coming. She has this she's an incredible observer of human beings. I think part of it maybe comes from this difficult, complicated childhood she had, also being in a remote place where she's perhaps just watching all kinds of stuff going on. She also is a great lover of literature and theater, and so understands the role the arts have played in expressing and exploring the human experience. And so her sensitivity to the individual person, also because she loves and respects the saints so much, her hagiography is very cautious not to jump to conclusions too fast or paint a simplistic picture. She really wants to try to explore what on earth is going on in this person's life. This is amazing. And that leads us into the topic of marriage, the fact that she's such a keen observer of human beings. I still haven't figured out what it was, but for some reason or another, she's absolutely passionate that marriage is it's a cornerstone of a civilization. And it's also a cornerstone of life in the Catholic Church. And she comments on marriage in quite a few of her works. The two most significant ones that fortunately are both coming out in the next few months for the first time in English. The first from 1949, and this is the book through which I discovered Ida Görres. And when I discovered this book, already on the first paragraphs, not even the first pages, I was like, how is this not in English? This is amazing. So in 1949, she published a set of, again, we get to this genre of letters to young women on marriage and on being single. She explains in the book that several of these came from presentations she gave in the 1930s. In the 1920s, during the Catholic revival in Germany, she had a leading role in, had a leadership role in ministry to girls and women. In the 1930s, she was called to the Diocese of Meissen, where she was a secretary, that was her title, to run a ministry for girls and young women. And then again, after World War II, from this background that she has, she's asked to give a number of talks. And she sees marriage starting to break down and realizes we've got to address this issue. And this book is so beautiful. The first is a letter to a young woman who is about to get married and is excited about like the church wedding and stuff, but the actual church teaching on marriage, isn't this going to be like a little hard? Do we really have to take it that seriously? So it's this letter she gets, and then Ida Görres responds with just incredible sensitivity and nuance. I had a group of interns read the book with me to help me develop a study guide for the book, and we tested the study guide with them. And I've gotten repeated questions with them over several years. I finished this project years ago, but it couldn't be published for copyright reasons. And they said, when can we let our friends know this book is available tomorrow? So that's called On Marriage and on Being Single. And then it also addresses what was a new phenomenon at the time of women not marrying. Keep in mind, this is Germany after World War II. Huge number of young men have died in the war. Husbands have died. Plus, you have this new thing emerging of the career woman. Those two together, there's going to suddenly be a lot of women, young women, who aren't going to marry in a culture that still has lingering value, cultural value of marriage. And so that those two letters are going to be very helpful, I think, to many women today on what it means to be a lay Catholic woman and not married, and meaning in the spiritual life. And then the fourth one is a letter to a broken-hearted woman, and I still cry when I read it. So that's coming out from Ignatius Press in the spring, and then this fall, another book that's quite different. From 1971, in which, at a time in which she watched the sexual revolution coming inside the Catholic Church in Germany. She was a delegate at the Synod of Würzburg, and she saw what was going on with the effort, in particular, to allow divorce and remarriage in the Catholic Church. And in this book in 71, it's her parting salvo in life. She sent it to the publisher 8 days before she died. She looks at marriage from an anthropological view, and she dismantles the argument that the only foundation of marriage is love, and that if somebody some afternoon starts to not feel super excited, butterflies in the stomach love, well, then I guess it's not really a marriage anymore, and there should just be divorce. She dismantles that and looks instead at how the Catholic teaching on marriage is actually far more sensitive, appropriate, and fitting for a species that can get caught between the extremes of having kinship only and no individual choice in marriage versus opening Pandora's box and letting eros run wild. She says it's the Catholic teaching alone that is able to understand these parts of the human person, but offer an alternative that's going to balance and tame those. So there's a cover, the cover of that book is on one of the flyers in there. Now, I said her understanding of marriage goes far beyond marriage itself. And she understood how all of these different currents of understanding what reproduction is, what fertility is, were going to have a profound impact on culture's understanding of what this thing is that we call marriage. So I'd like to share with you some quotations of her works from some of these related issues about marriage that she says we have got to get right in order for culture to be able to support marriage. One is that she's got a very keen sense of man and woman. In the 40s, she says, the reality of the sexes belongs to the realm of things that are an eternal constant. This is just not even to be questioned. She starts to see, as I said, already in the 40s and 50s, she realizes a crisis is coming in the culture that is losing a sense of what marriage is. She comments, quote, "It is precisely marriage," this is 1949, "that bears and clearly reflects the marks of the intellectual strife of our era. Alongside this, there are all sorts of manifestations: free love, erotic play, prostitution, population policy, quote, safe sex, unquote. There are the most varied forms of temporary relationships, from marriage-like concubinage to temporary and weakened marriage. From the Lebensborn human breeding program, this was something the Nazis had, and related experiments to the dreadful mandrake-like perversion known as artificial procreation." End quote. So she sees that all of these other things that are happening are going to pose a very deep threat. And then in 1956, she observes, quote, "Each passing day, the conversation about marriage grows in gravity and urgency. For centuries, this important part of human life was deep and, it seemed, inextricably embedded in a complex, far-reaching structure of clan, folk, legal, economic, and religious ties, as well as traditions. Like a nut in the shell, the married couple's relationship with each other rested within something. It was elevated, sometimes in a double sense of this word. This protective and supportive housing of the past has long since been broken open, and the interior stands naked in an environment that has changed." I think that was 1956. 75 years later, even more parts of that shell have cracked apart. And if you see the book cover in there of What Binds Marriage Forever, having heard this quotation, you'll understand why I chose a painting for the cover that's called Walnut in Eden. And it's this beautiful painting, it's interesting, curious painting by a Russian painter of Adam and Eve in their first marriage, and they're inside of a walnut, protected. But that's gone. She saw very early on that the idea of contraception posed a challenge to our understanding of what marriage is. In the 1950s, she wrote, "If marriages are going to remain deliberately sterile, then there is no longer any logical, conclusive argument against homosexuality." In a letter in 1964, she reflected, "I sometimes wonder what the mysterious and terrible text of Revelation could mean, about a third of the springs being poisoned. Sometimes the diabolical inventions of our time to prevent fertility, the contraceptive pill and such, come to mind, but sometimes also the drying up of the deep wells of monastic life. It probably applies to both of them and more." And after the 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was extremely controversial in Germany, she writes about priests having nervous breakdowns, including one she knows who ended up in the hospital for a week after trying to defend Humanae Vitae and being attacked so brutally. Still, she called that encyclical prophetic. She also, with this keen sense of man and woman, while she isn't what one might think of as like a hardcore reactionary traditionalist, she instead is just deeply connected to reality and what also she has been able to learn about reality through Revelation and the church. And so she has, from 1951, a very harsh review of the book, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And in this review, she says that what Simone de Beauvoir is talking about is that, quote, "Here we find the most complete and consistent exposition of an atheistic doctrine of woman. Quote, religion, unquote, is treated on relatively few pages and in scattered marginal notes, with careless scorn and a clear gesture of indifference, which in itself is supposed to indicate the unspeakable irrelevance, quirkiness, and slightly comical silliness of the subject. Only rarely does a flicker of the most poisonous hatred strike, but the whole book comes from the unwavering atheism of Jean-Paul Sartre." And then she hones in a little bit more specifically on what's going to be the impact of developing a concept of man and of woman on the assumption that we're all just physical material, God doesn't exist. Who is man and who is woman in a godless world? She writes in this review of Simone de Beauvoir's book, quote, "The fully developed, lavishly illustrated atheistic theory of woman betrays astonishingly clearly a basic trait of the satanic, boundless hatred of creation. It is actually quite clear. Whoever hates the creator, the auteur, must necessarily hate, deny, devalue, and insult what, quote, is given, unquote. What is from him, therefore nature. The deeper we grasp the connection between creator and creation, the more clearly this basic law of consistently anti-divine thinking reveals itself. Idolatry of the world is relatively harmless next to this. At least it still recognizes the merits of the divine work. It admires the mirror image, even if it prefers the mirror image to the archetype with conscious defiance. True anti-theism goes further. It hates everything that might be recognizable as a trace, a shadow, a sign, a message of the one who is hated from the outset," end quote. And going from there, by the way, in her journals from the 1950s, which are available in English in a book called Broken Lights, she has a whole section in there on sex, marriage, and eros. They're fragmentary thoughts. They're from her journals and from some letters. But there she's starting to share her observations and pick up on themes that she's going to develop later in her work, as she senses relatively early on and is sounding the alarm bell that we're going to lose something very, very deep, and here's why. Now, moving lastly to the topic of the church, which she loved so much. When she passed away in 1971, at which time the priest who gave the eulogy at her funeral was a certain priest named Father Joseph Ratzinger. And one of the fans of her work, who loved reading her writing, wrote in and suggested that the epitaph on her gravestone should read, "She loved the church." So what does it mean to her then by the late 60s, in which, really in Germany and elsewhere too, but when I read her works from the 1960s and early 70, 71, everything is falling apart, and she's having to watch it in real time. In the spring of 1969, a week before the Novus Ordo was issued, she wrote an essay called, she wasn't timid, she called it "Demolition Crews in the Church." And she published it in an Austrian newspaper. She isn't just saying, "This is awful, this is awful, this is awful." She's still trying to understand, or trying to just begin to understand what's happening and what do we need to do to respond. Also, she's a very famous Catholic writer at this point, and she has many correspondents, so she's also having more and more people come to her saying, "Ida Görres, what's going on? What do we do? What do we do? Help me, I'm losing my faith." So this is one of two efforts that she has to try to sound the alarm bell against some of what's going on, but also help Catholics figure out how are we going to navigate this. And even in this time of crisis, she notes that, quote, "The church is the holy church. Despite all blemishes and wrinkles, she is the sanctified one, the bride, that is the chosen vessel of grace. She's the place where the holiness of God is enthroned presently and visibly. She is all this because in the sacraments, in the sacrament, the Lord himself meets and touches us." So she still tries to stay grounded, but also she calls a spade a spade. She writes, for example, "How much secret unbelief reluctantly concealed, even by priests, now takes up oxygen inside the church as a painful, unsavory self-cleansing of the church body, like a body ridding itself of deep-rooted poisons through bursting abscesses and ugly skin rashes." She also observes, quote, "So much that is ugly and embarrassing about this eruption process is both liberating and healing. It is better for the spirits to part than for fifth columns to move undetected among us." And then she has this image of caution against more jackhammers inside the churches destroying everything, of this attitude that she's watching happen by those who believe, I think this is turned on, that we just need to get rid of everything to start over. She comments, quote, "Last summer on an empty beach, when the tide came in during the morning, I had an opportunity to watch how the high tide, ripple by ripple, pressing forward, came up to the most beautiful sand castles from the previous day. It swished around, flowed in, eroded, and disintegrated them until they were unrecognizable. No subsequent ebb tide left them visible. We have lived in an ebbing of the church for a very long time. Now, a spiritual high tide roars in slowly and irresistibly. It is a time of rejoicing and a threat at the same time. The youth movement, she's referring to the Catholic revival in the 1920s, too, was an early singular advance that has long since become overwhelmed by a more powerful surge. And she doesn't mean that for the better, more powerful surge, by another surge. But the same landscape, also this image of the ocean being at the edge of the ocean, also displayed the dams and dikes by which a population wages a large-scale heroic defense against the seemingly absolutely overwhelming ocean tide, just when it wants to eat away the ground under their feet, the bedrock of life. We have to learn to distinguish, end quote. And so this we have to learn to distinguish is something she tries to emphasize with nuance but incredible passion. And this image of the bedrock of life, well, the reference here isn't direct. In her book, The Church in the Flesh, when she's trying to explain what the church is to Catholics who are falling away from the faith, who are saying, can't we just be spiritual and not religious? Bedrock is one of the images she uses of the church, and a chapter of the book is called Bedrock and Tree. How it's a bedrock underneath us, like a massive granite foundation that might go on for miles, and a living tree. And so I really love this image of how she comes to appreciate that levees at the ocean exist for a purpose, and if you just rip all the levees out at once, you will have failed to see why the population that was there before put some of them in for a very good reason. Another insight she has to help believers who are in a crisis around 1960, 70, 71 is in a lecture that she delivered in 1970 to Catholics who were really in despair. And the lecture is called Trusting the Church. And this is, in his eulogy for her, the then Father Ratzinger quotes one text by Görres, and it's this lecture, Trusting the Church, that he quotes repeatedly. And in that she writes that she considers church history the great consolation. She was very learned in church history, and she had seen crises and had also seen individuals be raised up and answer the call of courage to respond to crises. And so she's also saying, we don't know what's going to happen, hang in there. It's a really great, I think it's a really beautiful text. And friends I know who have been telling me in recent years they've been having a hard time in faith, and I've said, you gotta read this, have said to me, I think she wrote this for me personally. So when that comes out in the spring from Ignatius Press in a book called Bread Grows in Winter, I highly recommend it. And that book, Bread Grows in Winter, also has demolition crews in the church, and it has a wonderful essay she wrote on in defense of celibacy. It also has an essay that I think she initially gave as a lecture called The Spirituality of Studying Theology, where she's watching the rise of what today we would call religious studies, and this massive influx also of lay people from a huge variety of backgrounds, all wanting to study religion and study theology. She's basically trying to reconnect the study of theology with things like prayer. And this summer, in a collection of letters from Joseph Pieper between Joseph Pieper and Hans Urs von Balthasar, I found a letter from Joseph Pieper who said to Hans Urs von Balthasar, have you read that new essay by Ida Friederike Görres? I wish we could put it into the hand of every single student studying theology. So that's coming out this spring. But back to this question of how we're going to deal with the church in a time of crisis. What she does, she so often does, is, first of all, she turns to the Bible. She absolutely loved the Bible, and through a big spreadsheet I made of quotes of hers from the Bible, trying to figure out what translation she was doing. And I went through 17 different published German translations of the Bible, and none of them matched. So I started to wonder, well, maybe, and I think perhaps she's translating from the Vulgate. And one friend suggested, well, maybe she's taking the passages out of her missal. So I compared all these passages from the Bible, from her works, to which passages are in the traditional Latin missal, and they don't line up. She's quoting a lot of things that are outside of that. She's into the Bible, but she also loves the liturgy. And spending time with her works has helped to get me know the liturgy better. So in this time of crisis in the church, she turns to the liturgy and shares a passage that's in there for the Saturday after Ash Wednesday. And it has a passage from Isaiah, quote, "And you shall be like a watered garden, like a flowing spring whose waters never fail. Your people shall rebuild the ancient ruins. The foundations from ages past you shall raise up. Quote, repairer of the breach, end quote, they shall call you, quote, restorer of the ruined dwellings, end quote." And then she comments on this, quote, "The church today faces indictment, judgment, confession, repentance, and reparation. God is gracious to the penitent, and the sign of grace is the hope that this prophetic word promises to those who repent," end quote. Thank you.